The diplomatic vessel Harmony floated in neutral space between human and Zephyrian territories, its conference halls buzzing with the controlled tension of first contact negotiations that could determine the future of interstellar trade for both civilizations. Lieutenant Jake Sullivan checked his translation equipment one final time, acutely aware that his role as cultural liaison could make the difference between successful diplomacy and catastrophic misunderstanding. "Remember, Lieutenant," Ambassador Elena Vasquez said during their final briefing, "the Zephyrians place enormous emphasis on precise language and respectful discourse. Their cultural codes consider casual comments about personal appearance to be serious violations of social dignity." Jake nodded, reviewing his notes about Zephyrian social protocols for what felt like the 100th time. 3 months of preparation had taught him that their potential allies were a proud species whose complex honor systems governed every aspect of interpersonal interaction, making diplomatic precision essential for successful negotiations. Any comment that could be interpreted as inappropriate personal observation could derail these talks, the ambassador continued. Their envoy, Zaratil, is particularly respected within their government. Any perceived disrespect toward her would have severe political consequences. The briefing concluded just as the Zephyrian delegation's shuttle docked with Harmony. Jake took his position in the reception hall, trying to calm his nerves while reviewing the formal greeting protocols that would set the tone for the entire negotiation process. When the airlock cycled open and the Zephyrian delegation entered, Jake felt his carefully maintained professional composure waver. He had studied images and video recordings during his preparation, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of seeing Zaratil in person. She stood nearly 6 feet tall, her lithe frame moving with unconscious grace that spoke of genetic enhancements and centuries of refined evolution. Her skin held a subtle luminescence that shifted with her emotions, while her hair fell in silver waves that seemed to capture and reflect the hall's artificial lighting. The pointed ears that marked her species were elegant rather than alien, and her violet eyes held intelligence that made Jake immediately aware he was in the presence of someone formidable. But it was more than just her obvious beauty that affected him. Zaratil carried herself with the kind of confident authority that commanded instant respect, speaking with diplomatic precision while maintaining warmth that made formal protocols feel like genuine conversation. "Lieutenant Sullivan," she said, extending her hand in the human gesture of greeting that she had obviously studied as carefully as he had learned Zephyrian customs. "I understand you will be facilitating communication during our discussions. I appreciate having someone who understands the importance of precise cultural translation." Jake managed to respond appropriately, though he was acutely aware of how her presence seemed to fill the reception hall. "It's an honor to work with someone of your reputation, Envoy Zaratil. I've studied Zephyrian diplomatic achievements extensively." "Please, call me Zara," she replied with a smile that transformed her formal beauty into something more approachable. "If we're going to spend the next week working through complex trade agreements, we should establish comfortable communication patterns." As the formal reception proceeded, Jake found himself impressed by more than just Zara's obvious attractiveness. Her intelligence was evident in how she handled complex questions, her diplomatic skill showed in how she managed competing interests within both delegations, and her sense of humor emerged in subtle ways that made everyone around her more relaxed. "The resonance frequency modulation in your translation equipment is quite sophisticated," Zara observed during a break in the formal presentations. "Our linguists have been working on similar technology, but your approach to tonal variation mapping is more elegant than our current systems." Jake felt genuine pride at the compliment, especially coming from someone whose people were renowned for their technological achievements. "Thank you. We found that accurate cultural translation requires more than just vocabulary conversion. Emotional context and social nuance often matter more than literal meaning." "Exactly," Zara agreed, her expression brightening with the kind of enthusiasm that academics showed when discussing their specialties. "Too many diplomatic failures result from assuming that accurate translation means precise word-for-word conversion, when the real challenge is conveying intent and cultural context." Their conversation continued through the evening's formal ceremonies, creating a professional rapport that made Jake optimistic about the negotiations' prospects. But he was also becoming increasingly aware of a personal problem that his diplomatic training hadn't prepared him to handle. Zara Teal was not just intelligent and professionally competent, she was also incredibly attractive in ways that made maintaining proper diplomatic distance increasingly difficult. Every gesture revealed grace that seemed almost choreographed, every expression showed intelligence that made conversation stimulating, and every movement reminded Jake that he was working with someone whose physical beauty matched her intellectual capabilities. "Lieutenant Sullivan," Zara said as the reception concluded, "I look forward to our collaboration during the technical discussions. I have a feeling that accurate communication between our peoples will require creativity and flexibility rather than rigid adherence to predetermined protocols." Jake agreed, though he was beginning to worry that his own flexibility might extend to areas that diplomatic protocol strictly prohibited. Working closely with someone he found both intellectually fascinating and physically attractive was going to test his professional composure in ways he hadn't anticipated. As he prepared his daily report that evening, Jake reflected on the challenge he was facing. The negotiations were crucial for both civilizations, requiring absolute precision in communication and flawless adherence to cultural sensitivities. Any personal distraction could derail months of preparation and damage interspecies relations for generations. But looking at his notes about Zara Teal's comments, insights, and observations, Jake realized that his attraction went beyond simple physical appreciation. She was remarkable in ways that had nothing to do with her obvious beauty, intelligent, witty, professionally competent, and possessed of the kind of diplomatic skill that made complex problems seem manageable. The question was whether he could maintain proper professional boundaries while working closely with someone who challenged his self-control in multiple ways. His success as cultural liaison depended on precise language and appropriate behavior, but his growing appreciation for Zara Teal was making both increasingly difficult to maintain. As he settled in for the night, Jake promised himself that he would keep his observations about their remarkable envoy strictly internal, no matter how distracting her presence might become during the intensive negotiations ahead. The second day of negotiations brought both delegations into the technical conference rooms where the real work of treaty construction would take place. Jake arrived early to calibrate translation systems and review communication protocols, determined to maintain absolute professionalism despite his growing appreciation for the Zephyrian envoy. "Good morning, Jake," Zara greeted him as she entered the conference room, carrying data tablets and holographic projectors that suggested a day of intensive technical discussions. "I hope your translation systems are prepared for some challenging terminology. Today's resource allocation proposals involve concepts that don't translate cleanly between our languages." Jake found himself once again struck by how she managed to combine formidable intelligence with approachable warmth. "I've loaded the specialized technical dictionaries and prepared fallback protocols for concepts that might require cultural explanation rather than direct translation." "Excellent," Zara replied, beginning to set up her presentation materials. "I found that successful negotiations depend more on mutual understanding than perfect linguistic precision. Sometimes the best translations require creative interpretation." As the morning sessions progressed, Jake discovered that working closely with Zara was both easier and more difficult than he had anticipated. Her professional competence made his job straightforward. She spoke clearly, paused for translation when needed, and helped resolve communication difficulties with patience and good humor. But her intelligence and diplomatic skill also made her increasingly attractive in ways that had nothing to do with her obvious physical beauty. Jake found himself genuinely impressed by her analytical thinking, her creative problem-solving approaches, and her ability to find compromise solutions that satisfied competing interests. "The shipping logistics are more complex than either side initially estimated," Zara explained during a particularly challenging discussion about trade route management. "Our territorial boundaries overlap in ways that require careful coordination to avoid jurisdictional conflicts." Jake worked to translate the technical details while simultaneously appreciating how Zara moved around the conference room, using gesture and spatial positioning to make complex concepts more understandable. Her diplomatic presentations were like watching performance art that happened to involve interstellar trade policy. "Lieutenant Sullivan," she said during a brief recess, "you've been remarkably helpful in resolving translation difficulties. Your cultural insights have prevented several potential misunderstandings." "Thank you," Jake replied, feeling genuinely pleased by her recognition. Though I have to admit, working with someone who understands both the technical details and the cultural implications makes my job much easier. Mutual professional appreciation, Zara said with a smile that made Jake acutely aware of how her expressions enhanced her already striking features. I suspect we make an effective team. The afternoon brought more complex negotiations as both sides attempted to resolve disagreements about resource allocation percentages and transportation responsibilities. Jake found himself working closely with Zara to ensure that technical specifications were accurately communicated between delegations whose approaches to engineering and logistics differed significantly. The quantum resonance frequencies in your cargo transport systems operate on different harmonic principles than our gravitational manipulation technology, Zara explained, manipulating holographic displays that showed three-dimensional models of various spacecraft configurations. Jake translated the technical details while trying not to be distracted by how her movements around the conference table showcased the elegant lines of her figure. The formal diplomatic robes she wore were designed for professional authority, but they also revealed enough of her physical presence to make maintaining focus increasingly challenging. Perhaps we should examine the compatibility matrices more closely, Zara suggested, moving to adjust the holographic projectors in ways that required her to turn and reach in directions that tested Jake's ability to concentrate on technical translation rather than personal observation. That makes sense, Jake replied, though he was beginning to realize that his appreciation for Zara extended well beyond her professional capabilities. Every gesture revealed grace that seemed effortless, every expression showed intelligence that made conversation stimulating, and every movement reminded him that he was working with someone whose combination of beauty and competence was becoming a serious distraction. The day's most challenging moment came during discussions about atmospheric processing requirements for joint mining operations. The technical concepts required precise translation between species whose understanding of environmental management differed significantly, creating multiple opportunities for misunderstanding. Our atmospheric processors are designed to handle trace compounds that human systems might not detect, Zara explained, moving to display spectral analysis charts that showed the chemical compositions of various planetary atmospheres. Jake found himself struggling to maintain professional focus as Zara's presentation required her to move frequently around the conference room, adjusting displays and pointing to specific data sets in ways that emphasized her physical presence while simultaneously showcasing her intellectual capabilities. The compatibility requirements are more stringent than either side initially anticipated, she continued, her movements creating what Jake was beginning to recognize as a serious challenge to his self-control. By evening, Jake realized that his attraction to Zara had evolved from simple physical appreciation to genuine admiration for her character and capabilities. She was remarkable in ways that went far beyond obvious beauty, intelligent, competent, diplomatically skilled, and possessed of humor and warmth that made complex negotiations feel like engaging conversations. But he was also becoming increasingly aware that his professional composure was beginning to show strain. Working closely with someone he found both intellectually fascinating and physically attractive was creating internal commentary that he needed to keep strictly private. Tomorrow's discussions will focus on cultural exchange protocols, Zara announced as the day's sessions concluded. I suspect those conversations will require even more creative translation approaches. Jake agreed, though he was beginning to worry that his own creativity might extend to areas that diplomatic protocol strictly prohibited. His growing appreciation for Zara Teal was becoming a distraction that could interfere with his ability to facilitate accurate communication during crucial negotiations. As he prepared his evening reports, Jake promised himself that he would maintain absolute internal discipline during the coming discussions, no matter how distracting Zara's presence might become. The success of the negotiations depended on precise communication and cultural sensitivity, both of which required him to keep his personal observations strictly private. The question was whether his internal filters were strong enough to handle another day of working closely with someone who challenged his professional composure in multiple ways simultaneously. The third day of negotiations brought the most critical discussions as both delegations attempted to finalize agreements that would determine trade relationships for the next decade. Jake arrived at the main conference room early, determined to maintain absolute professional focus despite the personal distractions that Zara's presence had begun to create. Today's agenda is particularly challenging, Ambassador Vasquez briefed her team before the Zephyrian delegation arrived. "We need to resolve resource allocation percentages, establish transportation protocols, and create cultural exchange frameworks. Any communication errors could derail months of preparation." Jake double-checked his translation equipment and reviewed cultural sensitivity protocols, acutely aware that the day's high-pressure environment would test his ability to maintain the internal discipline that diplomatic success required. When Zara entered the conference room, she carried herself with the focused intensity that important negotiations demanded. "Good morning, Jake. Are you prepared for what promises to be our most complex discussions yet?" "As prepared as possible," Jake replied, though he was already noticing how the formal lighting enhanced the luminescent quality of her skin and the intelligence in her violet eyes. "The technical terminology for today's topics is particularly challenging to translate accurately." "I have confidence in your abilities," Zara said with a smile that made Jake acutely aware of how her professional competence was matched by personal warmth that made even formal proceedings feel engaging. The morning sessions focused on resource allocation percentages that required precise mathematical translation between species whose numerical systems operated on different logical foundations. Jake found himself working closely with Zara to ensure that quantity specifications were accurately communicated without the rounding errors that could create major economic discrepancies. "The extraction rates need to be calculated using base 12 mathematics rather than your decimal system," Zara explained, manipulating holographic displays that showed complex mining operations across multiple star systems. Jake translated the technical details while simultaneously appreciating how Zara's movements around the conference table combined professional authority with unconscious grace. Her diplomatic presentations were like watching someone who had perfect mastery of both technical concepts and physical presence. "The conversion algorithms are more complex than our initial estimate suggested," she continued, moving to adjust the display settings in ways that required her to turn and gesture around the holographic projectors. As the negotiations intensified, Jake found his internal commentary becoming increasingly active. The combination of stress, complex technical translation, and Zara's distracting presence was making it harder to maintain the mental filters that kept his personal observations private. The critical moment came during discussions about shipping logistics for joint mining operations. Zara was presenting detailed proposals about cargo capacity and transportation efficiency, moving around the conference room to display holographic models that required frequent position changes and gesture combinations. "The gravitational displacement calculations must account for cargo distribution that affects ship stability during hyperspace transitions," she explained, moving to adjust the holographic controls that were positioned across the room from the main display area. Jake found himself thinking about how the cut of her formal diplomatic robes enhanced her figure in ways that made concentration on technical translation increasingly difficult. The professional garments were designed for authority and cultural appropriateness, but they also revealed enough of her physical presence to make maintaining focus a serious challenge. "The load balancing requirements are more stringent than either side initially anticipated," Zara continued, turning to point at specific technical specifications while explaining complex engineering concepts that required precise cultural translation. Jake was thinking about how her movements showcased the elegant lines of her physique, specifically noting how well-proportioned her posterior appeared in the fitted diplomatic robes, when his internal discipline finally failed him completely. "Damn, that's a nice ass," he said, his internal observation becoming an audible comment that carried clearly through the conference room's enhanced acoustics. The effect was immediate and devastating. Both delegations froze in shocked silence as everyone processed the fact that humanity's cultural liaison had just made an inappropriate comment about the Zephyrian envoy's body during the most critical moment of formal diplomatic proceedings. Jake felt his heart stop as he realized what he had done. The comment that he thought was safely internal had been spoken aloud in front of both diplomatic teams, representing exactly the kind of cultural insensitivity that could destroy months of careful negotiation. Ambassador Vasquez stared at him with an expression of horror that suggested she was calculating how to minimize the diplomatic catastrophe that had just occurred. The human technical specialists looked mortified, while the Zephyrian delegation seemed frozen in disbelief at what they had just witnessed. But it was Zara's reaction that would determine whether the negotiations could survive Jake's inexcusable breach of protocol. She had turned to face him when his comment registered, her expression unreadable as both delegations waited to see how she would respond to what appeared to be either a calculated insult or an unforgivable lapse in diplomatic professionalism. Jake prepared for the worst possible outcome: immediate expulsion from the negotiations, formal censure from his own government, and a complete collapse of trade discussions that both species desperately needed. His career was effectively over, but more importantly, his mistake might have destroyed the chance for peaceful cooperation between civilizations that could benefit enormously from successful partnership. The silence stretched across the conference room like a physical force, hundreds of hours of preparation hanging in the balance as everyone waited to see whether a moment of personal weakness had just derailed interstellar diplomacy. Zara looked directly at Jake, her violet eyes holding an expression he couldn't interpret, while both delegations held their breath to see whether the most promising negotiations in decades would survive one human's catastrophic failure of self-control. Jake realized that whatever happened next would determine not just his own future but potentially the relationship between two species whose cooperation could reshape the balance of power in their region of the galaxy. And it all depended on how Zaratil chose to respond to the most inappropriate comment in diplomatic history. The silence following Jake's accidental comment stretched across the conference room like a taut wire, every person present frozen in anticipation of Zaratil's response to what could only be interpreted as either a calculated insult or an inexcusable diplomatic failure. Jake felt his career and the entire negotiation process hanging in the balance as he waited for the explosion of outrage that would end his diplomatic service and potentially derail crucial interspecies cooperation. But Zara's reaction defied every expectation that either delegation had formed about appropriate Zephyrian responses to personal comments. Instead of expressing shock, demanding formal apologies, or calling for Jake's immediate removal from the negotiations, Zara turned to face him with an expression that combined amusement with something that might have been appreciation. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the stunned silence. "Lieutenant Sullivan," she said with what sounded like genuine humor, "I appreciate the compliment, though I should mention that Zephyrian physiology is quite different from human anatomy." Jake stared at her in disbelief, unable to process that she was treating his inappropriate comment as a conversation starter rather than a diplomatic catastrophe. "What you're admiring," Zara continued with the kind of clinical precision that suggested she was genuinely enjoying the educational opportunity, "is actually our primary respiratory enhancement organ. The gluteal region in Zephyrians contains specialized atmospheric processing chambers that allow us to extract oxygen from trace gases during extended space travel." Both delegations remained frozen as they tried to understand how a potentially devastating cultural incident was being transformed into a biology lesson. "The pronounced curvature that you find aesthetically pleasing," Zara explained, moving to activate a holographic display that showed Zephyrian anatomical structures, "results from enlarged respiratory storage chambers that provide approximately 40% additional oxygen processing capacity compared to our baseline physiology." Jake felt his mortification begin to mix with fascination as he realized that Zara was not only handling his mistake with remarkable grace but was actually using it as an opportunity for the kind of cultural exchange that the negotiations were designed to promote. "So when you appreciate the visual appeal of that particular aspect of Zephyrian anatomy," she continued with what was definitely amusement in her voice, "you're actually admiring a sophisticated biological adaptation that represents millions of years of evolutionary refinement for spacefaring survival." Ambassador Vasquez looked like she was trying to determine whether she should apologize profusely or simply accept that the crisis was being resolved through the most unconventional diplomatic approach she had ever witnessed. However, Zara added with a smile that transformed her formal beauty into something much more approachable, "I'm quite flattered that you find our biological adaptations aesthetically pleasing. Cross-species appreciation for physiological differences is exactly the kind of cultural understanding that successful cooperation requires." The Zephyrian delegation seemed equally surprised by their envoy's response, though several were beginning to show signs of amusement at how she had turned a potential diplomatic disaster into an impromptu xenobiology seminar. Dar. Kesterin, Zara addressed her own delegation's science specialist, "Perhaps this would be an appropriate time to discuss the physiological compatibility studies that will be necessary for joint mining operations." What followed was the most surreal hour of Jake's diplomatic career, as both delegations engaged in detailed scientific discussions about anatomical differences, environmental adaptation requirements, and the biological factors that would affect interspecies cooperation in various working environments. Lieutenant Sullivan, Zara said during a break in the technical presentations, "I hope my explanation clarifies why your observation, while personally flattering, was also scientifically accurate. Zephyrian respiratory enhancement does create anatomical features that many species find visually appealing." Jake felt his face burning with embarrassment and amazement. Envoy Zara Teal, "I cannot adequately apologize for my inappropriate comment. It was inexcusable and..." "It was honest," Zara interrupted gently. "And honesty, even when accidentally expressed, is exactly what successful partnerships require. Too many diplomatic relationships fail because people are so focused on saying the correct things that they never communicate what they actually think or feel." She moved closer, her expression serious despite the humor that had characterized her response to his mistake. "Jake, your comment revealed that you see me as an attractive individual rather than just a diplomatic representative. That kind of personal recognition, while inappropriately expressed, suggests the possibility of genuine friendship rather than purely professional cooperation." Jake stared at her, beginning to understand that his catastrophic mistake might have accidentally accomplished something that months of formal protocol had failed to achieve, the establishment of authentic personal connection rather than ritualized diplomatic interaction. "Of course," Zara added with returning humor, "future compliments about Zephyrian anatomy should probably be expressed privately rather than announced to entire diplomatic delegations." The remainder of the day's negotiations proceeded with an entirely different atmosphere. Jake's accidental breach of protocol had somehow created permission for both delegations to communicate more naturally, leading to the most productive discussions they had experienced since arriving on Harmony. "You know," Zara said as the formal sessions concluded, "your mistake today might have been the most diplomatically effective communication failure in recorded history." Jake was still processing the extraordinary way she had handled his inexcusable comment. "I still can't believe you turned my inappropriate observation into a cross-species biology lesson." Intelligence, humor, and the ability to find opportunity in apparent disaster, Zara replied with a smile that made Jake realize his attraction to her had evolved far beyond physical appreciation. Those are the qualities that make partnerships work, whether they're diplomatic or personal. As they prepared to leave the conference room, Jake reflected on how completely his understanding of both diplomacy and Zara Teal had changed in the span of a few hours. His accidental comment had revealed not just his own lack of self-control but her extraordinary character, the kind of intelligence that could turn problems into opportunities, the confidence to handle personal comments with grace rather than offense, and the humor that made even embarrassing mistakes feel like shared experiences rather than unforgivable failures. "Jake," Zara said as they gathered their materials, "I hope you've learned something valuable about both Zephyrian physiology and the importance of maintaining internal verbal discipline during formal proceedings." "I've learned," Jake replied, "that the most remarkable thing about you isn't your respiratory enhancement organ, impressive as it apparently is. It's your ability to turn my biggest professional failure into an opportunity for genuine connection." Zara's smile suggested that his accidental honesty had indeed created possibilities that diplomatic protocol alone could never have achieved, the foundation for friendship built on mutual respect, shared humor, and the understanding that authentic relationships require the courage to be genuinely human, even when humanity included occasional spectacular failures of self-control.